Hello everyone. This is Christian and Adrian's video. And this is our gait video. First, we're going to start off with, we're going to use the standard terminology. We're going to go with the heel strike first. The heel strike is at about 30 degrees of flexion at the hip and about 5 degrees of flexion at the knee, about 5 degrees of plantar flexion at the ankle, and about 2 to 3 degrees of inversion at the foot. Up next, we got the flat foot. At the flat foot, we have about 30 degrees of flexion. We have about 20 degrees of flexion at the knee, and we have about 10 degrees of flexion, plantar flexion, at the ankle. Up next, we have the mid stance. Pardon me. At the mid stance, we have about 5 degrees of flexion at the hip. We have about 5 degrees of flexion at the knee, and we have about 5 degrees of plantar flexion at the ankle. Up next, we got the heel off. At heel off, we got about 10 degrees of extension at the hip. We have about 5 degrees of flexion at the knee, and we have about 10 degrees of plantar flexion at the ankle. Then we have the toe off. At toe off, we have about 10 degrees of extension at the hip. We have about 35 degrees of flexion at the knee, and we have about 20 degrees of plantar flexion at the ankle.
All right, now we're going to be talking about the swing phase. We're going to still be using standard terminology. So the first part of the swing phase is the acceleration phase. So this is when your foot is just leaving the ground. Plantar flexion is at 10. The knee is bent anywhere from 35 to 60 degrees. And the hip is at 30 degrees. Moving on to the mid-swing. The hip is still at 30 degrees. Your knee is now flexed at about 65 degrees. And we are now in dorsiflexion. So that's going to be 10 degrees. And finally, we're going to decelerate. So this is called the acceleration phase. Here, the hip is still at 30 degrees. The knee can now be anywhere from 60 to 0 degrees. And dorsiflexion is still at 10. And that'll be the end of the swing phase.